Well, good afternoon. We shall get started. Welcome to this afternoon panel. Let me see if I can get this to work. Oh. Perfect. All right, so good afternoon. Welcome to this panel. I think it's very appropriate to have this panel after the session we had just before lunch, right? It set the stage for many of the issues that we'll be discussing in this panel. The focus here is on the role of research infrastructures on training the digital workforce. I've talked about this. So I wanted to start off by saying a little bit about me for two reasons. This is my first time at ICRI, so I want to tell you a little bit about why I'm here, but also give you a context of different perspectives that sort of I bring to this discussion here. Right. So currently, I'm at the University of Utah, and I lead the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute, which is a translational transdisciplinary institute. And what that means is that we work at the intersection of computing, data, and sciences across many, many disciplines. And because it's translational, building software, data products, infrastructure is a big part of it. And some of the challenges we face is around workforce, right? How do we get the workforce? How do we train the workforce? How do we create the next generation workforce? Before joining Utah about a year back, or a year and a half, I was with the US federal government. I was directing the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure and spent some time at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where we were funding infrastructure. And again, workforce, human capital was critical, right? They were sort of central to the success of any of the infrastructure we funded, right? And so that was the most critical part. And before that, I was in charge of building out the infrastructure for the US Ocean Observatories Initiative. And again, workforce was central to that, right? So there are different perspectives of the workforce that come in, right? And now we're working on a project called National Data Platform, which creates a platform that sits across on top of the research infrastructure, making data both collectively and individually more accessible from the user community. And again, workforce is really critical to making anything like this successful. So coming back to this panel, right, our charge was to look at what is, recognizing that this infrastructure is a great resource for training the next generation, training the workforce. How can we leverage this, right? What are the strategies for developing expertise, both in the foundational computational skills that are important to utilize a lot of these features, infrastructure, and how do we empower researchers to really harness these tools that the research infrastructures provide, right? So if I parse this, it sort of falls into three buckets for me. The first one is digital workforce at the research infrastructures. What I mean is you have a workforce that makes sure that the research infrastructure is able to fulfill its mission, meet its goals, right? So how do you train that workforce? How do you make sure they remain trained? How do you upskill them, retrain them? How do you provide the incentives, career paths, reward structures, right, that are so essential and often missing in many academic structures for this workforce? The second one is, what is the role of training for digital workforce for the RI? This is a user community, right? How do you make sure they have the skill sets, the awareness, the ability to be able to leverage the research infrastructure most effectively? And the last one is, how do you make sure that we can use research infrastructure to train the next generation? And we saw some great examples of this in the session just before lunch, where we use this to be able to really excite the next generation, create these as learning laboratories where they can be part of the science going on in the infrastructure, and use that to really train, incentivize the next generation. So given that framing, and we have to think beyond it, so we have to think about what the future is. So I asked the different generative models out there, Gemini and ChatGPT, about what is the digital workforce for research infrastructure, right? And here are the answers I get, and it's interesting. And maybe there's some truth to it as we look ahead, right? It's this combination of AI bots and human which are working in synergy, right? So I think not only thinking about what is the research workforce for our digital, for our research infrastructure today, but what is it going to look like, and how do we make sure that this synergistic environment is most effective? So with this kind of framing, let me introduce our panelists. What I'm going to do is to introduce them one by one, and they'll come up and give their opening statements, and then we'll do some Q&A with them. So our first panelist is Rosie Hicks, and she is the Chief Executive Officer at the Australian Research Data Commons, or ARDC, right, which is really providing Australian researchers with competitive advantage through data, right? And this is very relevant to here. So without delaying any further, let me call Rosie up on stage.
Wonderful. So thanks very much for joining this session this afternoon. And of course, my thanks to the Programme Committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. My thoughts here, as we've heard before lunch, this is absolutely a problem that everyone is acknowledging. No one is saying, oh, we don't have a problem with getting the right skills workforce. So we know we've got a problem. Now, I have a very practical frame of mind, and so when I have a problem, I'm seeking to break it down to have some attempt at creating an answer to that challenge. And so the pyramid that you see behind me is a step towards that. In breaking down the problem, what I'm looking at is how do we think about the different groups of people that need to be trained. At the top, we have the NCRIS facilities themselves. You've probably heard by now there's a couple of dozen NCRIS facilities here in Australia. Each of those, I believe, is responsible for keeping their own staff at the bleeding edge. Right? There is, whether it's a digital research infrastructure or any other type of infrastructure, we must do that for our own staff. I'll come back to the pink in a minute. So we've got the NCRIS staff then that are responsible for working with their user community and ensuring that indeed they can use that research infrastructure. Now for the ARDC, we run things such as Health Data Australia, Research Vocabs Australia. We have a role in ensuring that the user communities knows about these things and is able to use them. That's part of our job. Microscopy Australia, you heard from Lisa before lunch. They have MyScope and other initiatives. They do a lot to train their users. So far, so good. What I want to inject into this conversation today, though, is two things. The role of institutions in training researchers. And I know I'm smiling at some of them here in the audience. What sits with the institution? If we take, for example, fair data, it's been around long enough. We need researchers to be coming to the research infrastructures knowing about fair data. In contrast, if we're looking at care data, so we heard about that in the opening plenaries on Monday morning, perhaps the implementation of the care data principles are less well known, for example, in earth and environmental sciences. So a research infrastructure has a role in helping the adoption of the care principles. But the role of the institutions, where that sits, I think is a really important part of the conversation. And then finally, I'm jumping back up to the fuchsia pink. And I think this is a real opportunity across research infrastructures. How do we share expertise, knowledge, best practice between us? Right, we heard some of those initiatives being described before lunch, but I think that's the part that will go a long way to optimising the digital skills of our workforce, and I think that is an area of focus for us. Moving on, to enable a really good conversation between the universities, between institutions and the research infrastructures, we need some tools, we need some frameworks. Who does what? Now this is based on the ARDC's digital skills framework, but it's a slightly one-slide friendly adoption of it. What I want you to take away from it, though, is that we're considering the different roles needed in a digital research infrastructure, or to use the infrastructure, the skills that each of those roles would require, the degree of competency, and who's best positioned to provide that training. All right. Lots more information about this on the ARDC's website, really easy to find, but I think it's an important part of the conversation and putting clarity into this. Who does what? Doesn't mean we can't change it. Doesn't mean we can't have a really good conversation about what that matrix should be. But let's start from something. And then finally, I have permission from my fellow panelists for a shameless plug. Did you know International Data Week is going to be here in Brisbane next October? Come and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Okay, so our next panelist is Fotis Somopoulos, who is the senior researcher at the Institute for Applied Biosciences and the Center for Research and Technology, Hellas, in Greece. He's active in training efforts and initiatives, is on the Elixir Training Programs Executive Committee, and co-author of the Greek National Plan for Open Science. He also coordinates the European Virtual Institute for Research Software Excellence. Without any further delay, join me in welcoming Fotis.
Thank you. Right. Thanks. Also, many thanks to the organizing committee for the invitation. It's my first time in ICRI, also my first time in Australia, and I have to say that I'm loving it. So I'm really happy to follow the previous kind of quick intro because I absolutely agree with everything that was said. I want to give a very short perspective from a very European-centric point of view on how this kind of upskilling the digital workforce is one of the activities that the RIs can do together with the university, together with academy. And essentially the main element, and I have like three figures here, is that what can be done is essentially having the RIs, ideally the cross RIs, collaborate in order to identify what are the key elements, the standards, the expectations, the good practice that need to be followed in order to provide this training by the traditional academic environments. So on the top right, you see a map of the stakeholders, of the actors under EOSC. And these are different roles that are expected. So EOSC is the European Open Science Cloud. It's a cross-RI thing, I'll try to say. It's a vague notion still to an extent. But one of the key points is that it has a lot of people that are going to be active on that. And every kind of a role in there has a specific kind of niche, different roles, different skills, and different expectations. An RI is not expected to provide direct training on that, but the expectation would be that an RI that is part of EOS could identify what are these key competencies so that this can be specifically created by a university, by an institution that is doing the training delivery per se, so that this can be effectively communicated and you can upskill the training force. The same level, if you go in a more domain-specific infrastructure like Elixir, this can be more comprehensively implemented as a structure that really targets all the persons, all the people in the research in this domain. So Elixir is the European life sciences infrastructure, and one of the key elements that they have is a training platform. So the platform is kind of a nomenclature saying that it's kind of a organization thing, But one of the key outcomes, the flagship effort of the training platform, is essentially to train the trainer. So by providing these common structures, common activities, they can provide as an RI training to the nodes towards the participating members on how to deliver their training by providing structures, registries, infrastructure, and good practice on how to deliver those. The actual content is produced by the nodes, by the members, by the institutions themselves. So it's a very clear example of these two elements putting together. And of course, you can go one step further and have like thematic cross-domain activities like the one from Evers, which is about software related. Again, this is an effort to identify and promote activities that are cross-RIs, software is software regardless of the domain, but the expectations, the good practices, the quality perspectives that need to be part of a software development process are definitely coming across RIs because they are applicable and useful across all those efforts. And with that, thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, folks. So our next panelist is Dan Stanzioni. He's the executive director of the Texas Advanced Computing Center. It's one of the leading advanced academic computing centers in the world. He also holds the position of associate vice president at the University of Texas at Austin. He's PI for U.S. National Science Foundation's Leadership Class Computing Facility, which started construction this past July and is expected to begin operation in 2026. It'll deploy Horizon, which will be the largest academic supercomputer dedicated to open science research in the NSF's portfolio. So please join me in welcoming Dan.
Thanks, Manish. And thanks. I don't actually need the clicker because I didn't prepare any more slides because there's plenty. And about 2 months ago, we decided we weren't going to have a lot of slides, and then everybody caved. But so there's more and more slides with each passing hour as we got closer. But yes, I do run what is the newest major facility for the NSF in the Leadership Class Computing Facility. And although that is very new at TAC, we've been doing, it is mostly a transition in how we're funded and the scale of our funding. But we've been doing research computing for a very long time, as TAC for about 23 years, at UT long before that. I've been at this for about 32 years in research computing at this point. The archive system that we run at TAC goes back to 1986, which when you think about data sustainability, I would point out predates the founding of Google and Amazon by a substantial amount, which is the standard data sustainability choice at the moment, because they will be around forever, just like Intel. That'll be gone in 5 years. So and the railroads and Standard Oil. So we have, since we started at TAC, we've had more than 100,000 users into our facility because we're a large-scale computing facility. In some ways, we're research infrastructure for the other research infrastructure. We work with a ton of the other large facilities, both in the US and around the world, from astronomy to ecology to natural hazards engineering to biology, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. 4 of those 100K users have won Nobel Prizes in the last decade or so. We expect it'll be more as more and more of the research becomes computational over time. Right now, we run about 15,000 servers. We have more than 1 million cores of processor. We have thousands of GPUs. We have hundreds of petabytes of data, about 100 petabytes in the formal archive that's organized, and then hundreds of petabytes more of user data. We'll be going to an exabyte of data in the new leadership facility. Our staff has grown from about 10 in 2001 when TAC got started to a little over 200 now. In addition to the fact that we have 100,000 users, we have an amazingly diverse user base, right? Almost every field of science, AI has made this substantially worse because now it's even beyond science. I sort of think of it in sort of 3 groups. Our traditional users are sort of the Fortran C programmers who don't usually start with a lot of data, but do a huge amount of simulation and generate a whole bunch of data, the sort of traditional mod sim type approach. We have sort of the 2000 to 2018 period of new users, which was a lot of biology, when it accidentally became a computational science through the rise of genomic and imaging data and various other kinds of data. But more higher level languages and C++ and a ton of data analysis from genomics pipelines and but starting with a bunch of experimental data and then doing large scale analysis of it, often leading to simulation. And then lately we have the incredible influx of AI users, which are all Python, extremely low precision computation, no more of the double precision floating point painstaking stuff that we did in the mod sim world, which is why I've always joked AI is just high performance computing where no one cares if the answers are right. But part of that is our users are mostly graduate students, right? That is the number one thing. Postdocs is probably the second biggest category, and then sort of permanent research scientists, which means we have 8,000 to 10,000 new users every year. And they all sort of start at the same place. So as we try and provide training on more and more advanced digital skills over time, the trainers want to move stuff forward every year, but the students are always starting in sort of the same entry-level position because the curriculums aren't evolving. Obviously, the base computing skills that kids come in with have changed a bunch, but but in some ways, there's a lot of things that have disappeared, like any notion of how a file system works. The AI users in particular have no idea how computers actually work. So, but the number of new users means training is a constant battle, and the hard part, of course, is advancing people when every year it's a different set of people, right? We have, again, 25,000 typically active users in a year, so about a third are first year every single year. And as the years go by, that doesn't get better. So it's made some of this complicated. So we can't really teach the science, but we can teach some of the big missing pieces in the science from where we are, because most of what we do is software, understanding hardware to build software, and tuning software. So we do a vast amount of training, education, outreach. We start at the middle school level with students, mostly with the fairly broad focus of bringing them into STEM one way or another and looking at, science applications of computation. It turns out most of the science problems are more interesting than just computing problems, except to a very specific set of nerds. So we get a much broader audience when we, use different scientific contexts for that. We also do a ton of K-12 teacher training. We discovered 10 or 15 years ago that in Texas, where we are, a tiny state of 28 million people with about 1,400 high schools, I think there were 6 teachers teaching computer science who are actually certified to teach computer science. We have since trained a couple of thousand more, so at least is more than the number of high schools in the state who are actually certified. If you figure each of those hit 30 to 50 students a year for on average 25 years, we've now replicated that program in 38 other states, so that's where we're hitting the hundreds of thousands of people with at least the basic skills that provide a foundation for moving into these things. And then obviously it moves up. There is sort of generic training in things like parallel programming that we can do at sort of the undergraduate level, but we found as we get more advanced, when we get into data management, containers, web services, we really want to be discipline specific, which again is a challenge for us because we end up offering 35 versions of the same course across the disciplines, because data management for telescope data and data management for biological data or healthcare data, especially healthcare data, are very, very different kinds of topics. And even just the ability to attract people, well, if you put AI, you get 500 people to register for anything. But if we say, I don't know, web services for scientific applications, that'll have probably a fairly tepid response. If we say web services for bioinformatics applications or natural hazards engineering applications, that'll have a much more enthusiastic response and a much more similar set of skill sets in the students that show up for those trainings, and so that helps a lot. So, well, lots more to say on this topic, but we'll save it for the discussion because that's probably my 5 minutes plus. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So now we're going to move to the interactive part of this. So let me start by asking the first question, and in the meantime, think about questions you'd like to ask the panelists. So let me start with you first. What are the key skill sets that you think are needed by the digital workforce for research infrastructure, and where do you see the gaps?
So thanks for the question. Essentially, the main The main problem is that RIs are at the bleeding edge of research. So they provide services that really push the frontier forward. The challenge is that the actual users might not have the training to fully utilize those. So one of the key gaps right now is the knowledge gap between the services that an RI provides and the users, the researchers, the scientists that actually have the most to gain from using them in the first place. As I mentioned before, it's not only on the RI's problem to solve this, but it requires the co-creation between traditional academia and RIs to actually put curricula, modules in place to facilitate that. In terms of topics, I'm sure someone will mention AI at some point, so I'm not going to talk about this at all. But there are more foundational cross-RI things. Software, I mentioned already. Train the trainer activities, how to effectively train people, is also one of the easiest way to upskill at a scale. So these are just like a few topics, and I'm sure if we open up, we're going to have much more concrete ideas moving ahead.
Rosie or Dan, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, let me just add a couple things, and again, one shameless plug on my part, but I do want to echo the train the trainer part because it's really important. In the US, there's an organization called CASC of the Academic Scientific Computing Centers, and as sort of big national infrastructure, the one thing we've never been able to scale is the person down the hall, right? But there's at 115 other institutions in the US, there are academic research computing groups on campus, right? And keeping them at the cutting edge, mostly full-time staff, mostly there, but down the hall from their researchers, or at least in adjacent buildings to their researchers. Things we can do for them really magnify because we just can't get to every faculty member and every student. I do want to say that I think in gaps here, the biggest sort of missing dimension, and it has been alluded to several times at the conference, right? The enormous power demands of AI, right? That are growing by leaps and bounds and will represent, well, the curves aren't sustainable, right? But by 2030, on the current pace, it would be something like 15% of all the power generated by humanity. It's not going to happen. But but it's already, data centers are 4 or 5% of all the power generated. So we've never really put a focus on how effectively you use these infrastructures. There is some in sort of refereeing who gets time, because essentially if you couldn't run on hundreds or thousands of nodes, you weren't a big part of our power footprint. In our big system, people ask me what the average job size is, and I'm like, well, that's really misleading because we have sort of 600,000 serial jobs on the system last year. They ate 2.2% of the total time, right? The biggest 2,000 jobs ate 31% of the time of the million or so jobs on the system. So everybody running at 1 or 2 nodes, we could just sort of backfill in between the big jobs, and they had a negligible impact on consumption and on power. AI is making it really easy to run on 1,000 nodes, right? Unfortunately, we've taken away some of the challenges of running at large scale. It used to be you had enough sophistication that we knew you were using the right methods, essentially, if you could run on 1,000 nodes. And now people are just replicating what they run on a laptop and running it at 5 megawatts. So we haven't really thought about the green part of that, and we're going to have to. It's a lot harder to write software that's power efficient, but I think that's something we're going to have to train people in because it's becoming a sort of moral imperative.
Thank you. Let's see, are there...
in addition to tens of billions of dollars in power cost imperative.
Yeah, and that's been a theme of the discussion yesterday. How do you address this energy, right? And how do you train the next generation to be able to address them?
Just for the record, yes. Our current plans, which happened before the AI explosion, our power bill is about $11 million a year. Wow. And power is really cheap in Texas by comparison. Satoshi's power bill in Japan is much higher. five times higher.
Wow. Let's see. Well, you're still thinking... Oh, we have a question there. And maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm going to get a reputation. I'm Adam McLeod from CSIRO, work on the AquaWatch mission. I think my question is probably leaping off from that point, which is Aside from training, how do you see yourself as the gatekeeper for the access to these processing resources? I think my question is directed at Dan, but yeah, we have a similar issue that's coming our way. I'm just curious to know what you do when there's scientists and researchers who have developed code, they want to run it and test it, but it may not have been optimized, and in fact might be orders of magnitude more power hungry or resource hungry than it could be if it were optimized.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's a hard question. I will say, my first answer is I always try and avoid being, I mean, we are inevitably the gatekeeper, but I try and avoid being the gatekeeper as much as possible, right? We have independent review committees that look at who gets access and how much time they get on our platforms. The exception is the people who pay us directly, where I care less about their level of efficiency. And by the way, if you think cloud people are going to solve this problem, the big clouds, remember they sell computing by the hour. So their incentive is not to reduce the number of hours you use. So, you know, because training is one piece, allocations is probably the biggest piece where we gateway, right? Who gets how much time every year? And we are oversubscribed, right? The demand far outstrips what we can actually provide. So that process, which again, mostly we turn over to peer review committees, who do take into account to some degree that level of efficiency. But there are instances where I've had to override them. One that involves $1 billion and a Nobel Prize was, LIGO would never make it through the review committee because it's a big community taking this experimental data and mining it, and they could never do the sort of traditional scaling plots that the review committee wants to see for how this scales and detail exactly which experiments they were going to run this year. So the review committee kept rejecting them, and I kept saying, it's like 20% of our funding agency's budget. We really need to support this. So, we do have some of that role. Our sort of, on the one hand, we say the big mean people are the peer review committees that keep you off the systems, but we're very friendly at the centers and we'll give you a startup allocation and help you get to that scale. I do think we need to create new incentives for using it efficiently. I thought about changing from, compute hours used to joules consumed or something, but that's going to make life a lot harder for those review committees, so it's not an easy change. Anybody else want to?
Is this something you do to build that awareness to the new users coming in, right? I think people who have already been there, it's hard to change their behaviors.
Yeah, so speaking as an old dog, yeah, new tricks are harder. I think we don't do a great job of that, frankly, right? Because the new users are so overwhelmed by how much stuff is there. It's like, here's the basic things you need to know. Right, and then I'm not sure we ever get back to them with, okay, now that you know the basic things you need to know, here's the next set of things you need to know. And I think that's a challenge for all of us in all the infrastructures.
Rosie or Fortis, would you like to add anything?
I don't think I will, because this particular activity is not something that the ARDC is involved with.
I have a small comment to add to what Dan said. I'm from a research performing organization, so it's not an RI, but we're quite closely connected to the Elixir node in Greece. And one of the activities is to provide compute infrastructure. Gatekeeping goes with the territory, but what we are doing, and I feel it kind of works, is have a fully open, transparent system of who is running what, at what point and for how long. We've essentially built a wrapper system on top of a layer on top of the compute where everyone can sort of submit, I want to run this, and everyone knows how long, what they're using, and what they're trying to achieve. This helps in two ways. First, for new users, they can really see what can effectively be done there and possibly get new ideas. And also it gives kind of an accountability. If you have a person that is getting like 50% of the resources, you're hoping something will get out of it in the first place. So you're getting kind of, at the very least, some peer pressure. It's not that it's associated to a particular level of resources, like monetary resources, but again, it kind of makes a one-to-one connection there.
Yeah. I think there was another question there.
So I'm Siddhesh Group Program Lead for TURN. So this question is for Rosie. Rosie, thanks for showing the skill metrics. I was just wondering, the ARDC fund a lot of projects. Is there any metrics that is measured, the software that was developed, and then any metrics to measure the best practices that was followed in the development of the things? Is there something that is measured as part of the project?
Thank you. This is a really important topic for us, and I think it's something that we have a lot of work to do in digital research infrastructures. So I have to confess here, this is not my first NCRIS capability. And indeed, I spent 12 years with the National Fabrication Facility. And so I do bring a perspective that contrasts the physical infrastructures with the digital. In the digital, there is so much focus because it's been a very new field. I think we had some of the nice timelines given to us by Dan. But if you look at how much has changed in the last decade, it's enormous. So if we go back 10 years, there was absolutely a focus on seeding initiatives, seeding projects, building lots of infrastructure. And indeed, our metrics have been the completion of products and the availability of the tools. One of the things that isn't done so well at the moment is, as you say, measuring the uptake of those tools, which is an important conversation we're having within the ARDC and on a path to deliver those metrics. So how do we do that? Well, in some cases, if you're promoting access to national data assets, you really want to remove all the barriers for researchers to access them. So you're removing logons and complexity. So how do we know who's used it? These are some of the balances and the challenges that we have to tackle. But for example, when we do require a logon, so for the Nectar Research Cloud, I can see our Nectar director at the back of the room, implementing an ORCID for the logon so that we can tie that to the researcher and then look at the research outputs, I think is a really important step in maturing a research infrastructure's ability to monitor that pathway to impact. And I think for digital research infrastructures, where the engagement with the infrastructure, it's not finite in the compute sense. You know, when we want data used more and more and more, we're not trying to limit it. These are the type of difficult questions we have, but we must answer to justify the return on investment. But that is a slight digression from training, but it is a passion.
Yeah, we could have a whole session on metrics, but if I could just add one that is training related, we haven't done a good job, I'd say, of tracking this, if the training we deliver results in skills for our users, but one thing we have added tracking for in the last few years is sort of persistence. So we look at how many users come to training, when we get down to like the K-12 students, we're tracking how many of them make it into STEM fields, how many graduate in STEM fields, how many come back. But we do see how many attend future classes, how many get a permanent allocation, how many use the infrastructure, and we've started some longitudinal tracking on those sorts of things that give sort of interesting results that show it does make a difference and have a significant impact in some cases that you provide the training. But yeah, we have a project in natural hazards engineering where we're supposed to publish the data, and we have that exact fight with the review panel every year. So like, if we're publishing the data, you can download it anonymously. And if you download it anonymously, I can't tell you who they are and what they do with it with any sort of comprehension. But if we make it behind a login barrier, that's one of the #1 ways to get people to not use it, right? So fight that battle all the time.
Thank you. I'll phrase this in a slightly pejorative way.
My favorite.
There are two ways of running a compute center. You have a security guard, a locked door, and the rest of the community has to be trained up how to submit their data, code, sort it out, and then it's an easy life for the compute center, but you have to train up every scientist in the entire planet to be able to use the data. Or you could do it the other way around, where you say the scientists are idiots, we don't want them to learn coding, we're going to have 20, 30 really competent trained staff to handhold them and do through the process. We sort of try both ways and never get it quite right. What's your view on that balance of people, say, at your centre to handhold the new users and training the wider research base to be able to do some of it themselves?
Yeah, so from my perspective, you know, I think we have fairly open policies about getting people on, and then it's their ability to figure it out that sort of is the gateway there. You know, there are systems that we run extremely locked down in terms of, you know, how people can operate, but increasingly there's, you know, Jupyter notebooks and interactive portals and lots of different ways to get around some of those restrictions. And, you know, we fully support containers. You can run pretty much any software environment you can download and things like that now. But to that, how we engage, and there are, again, there remain different models because there's different scales of user base. For us, just the balance in sort of hardware versus staffing that I have, right? You know, so I have sort of in my primary teams that interface with users, right? There's 40 or 50 people in sort of the data and HPC areas, but 25,000 users, you know, on the other end, and the push is always to get more, right? So, so we're badly outnumbered, right? And that limits the handholding. I think the opposite model in the U.S. is the Department of Energy labs, right? That have giant computers, larger investments than ours, right, into the billions of dollars. But although they do take a number of users from academia, they mostly focus on their mission codes, right, 30 or 35 codes. They also mostly work for the Department of Energy, so they can do more targeted, right, through the funding agency, they can say, thou shalt, in terms of how they're going to use the machines and the programming models and fund them to rewrite their codes to use those infrastructures, right? I measured on one of our systems that we just shut down a couple of years ago, but it was sort of our broad access system. We ran 4,000 different codes on the life of it, right? I don't have enough people. I can't be an expert on 4,000 codes. All my people can't be an expert on 4,000 codes, right? We can be experts on the top 50, but the top 50 is only like 27% of our usage. So, so it's the other 4,000 that make that really hard. So that's why the focus more on training is we need to impart you the skills, because except for very specific types of problems that you might encounter, we're not going to be able to solve every problem for you, or essentially do the work for you, because there are simply too many of you. So we have a couple of dozen large projects that we're, you know, funded partners on, where we're definitely doing that sort of deep level of engagement. But it's really hard to do with, you know, the average single PI small lab that comes in. I mean, we give them whatever help we can, but again, we're just badly outnumbered.
Can I just add to that? Obviously, the efficiency and the limits on our staff are one important thing, but putting it with a different perspective, part of the role of the research infrastructure in building the digital workforce is really to provide that training on the products that we have, to enable that workforce to grow, to learn with us, to move to other capabilities, to come up with the next generation of tools, which they won't do if we don't let them really go in anger at the current set. So I think that's really important. But the other bit I'd add, and I think this is an area that's getting increasing focus right now, is we have to think about how we support discipline-specific needs. If you're working with the astronomers or genomics, their proficiency levels approaching the infrastructure will be rather different to those in social sciences. So that's another part we have to consider in our training. And then if we're looking at the solutions, you know, where does a user want to get to? You mentioned Jupyter Notebooks, Dan. How do we use the Binder Hub services in the social sciences to really help that research community fly and get the very best out of the infrastructure? And then I think we are really growing a digital workforce there.
So, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm Satoshi Matsuoka. I run this large computer called Fugaku. And,
Satoshi runs most of the computers in Japan and has forever, but anyway.
So my question is, so this AI question, which you avoided. So Dan was correctly pointing out we have exactly the same problem. That we never have enough people to train, for example, or to handhold people. And also our scope of users is increasing compared to the past. We only had, it's not just DOE. In the past, we were very narrowly focused, but now we have the plethora of users, not just grad students and so forth, but people from the industry, for example. And, they also need quite a bit of hand-holding. So the question is, what's AI? So let me give an example. So we're trying to transform our entire support operation into AI. For example, and we're starting to do that. For example, Fugaku's help system, which was used to be a ticket-based system, and still is, but now we added a chat-based AI system, which has a very sophisticated back-end RAG system that allows, that has suggested hundreds of thousands of lines of Fugaku manual. Now people can ask these questions and they get this interactive response. And we're planning on extending these kinds of services to allow users to essentially act with these infrastructures as if they had their own persona, just like HAL 9000 in 2001. So, do you think that's the right direction to go? And if so, how do we convince the funding agencies to support these kinds of activities? Because at the end of the day, we could never have enough people, and that's what AI. AI for science, on one hand, is having AI solve the most difficult problems in sciences, but also AI for science is to have the outreach of these scientific results and instruments to the users. So, and this also goes for data too. So, what?
Go ahead. Good.
So I think it's something we have to embrace enthusiastically. I don't think it's a replacement for the highly skilled, very warm-blooded technical staff that we have with our research infrastructures. But again, if we're really wanting to help the researcher to get the very best from the system, I think we should embrace every tool we possibly can to get us to that goal. How do we convince the funders? We just tell them the difference it's going to make. By the way, my funder is in the room behind you. And
mine's in the back.
We have to be able to put out a really clear case for why investing in this is not, we can't ignore it. We will get greater return on the investment to date. We will grow the skills base. We will have a greater reach with any research infrastructure. So, I'm glad you brought that one up because it's absolutely jump in, boots and all.
Yeah, and it is yes, an acceptable answer. But I do think it's understated how much AI can transform our internal operations and how much of an impact that's going to have on science beyond what you use AI in science for, right? We also have Attack GPT that generates a draft answer to every ticket. I still send it to our human consultant before we send it out to users because 85% of the time it's right, 15% of the time it's making stuff up out of thin air. But humans only do that about 10% of the time with tickets. So so yeah, we're not to the point where we put it out to users, but we're using it to enhance productivity. All of our programmers use AI tools, right? I think our mutual colleague Rick Stevens' example is about, if you need to summarize 250,000 papers to look at the effect of a particular gene or a particular sequence on a particular disease, before you start running your lab assays, then AI is remarkably effective at that, even if you don't use its predictions for anything else, right? Just all of that background research that is traditionally the work of many grad students over many months, right? So, and then even more incrementally, I do think the sort of interaction of humans and AI augmented tools is, it was in the AI generated self-serving answers by Manish's AIs that were there where they were pushing their own agenda. By the way, there's two big dangers right now. One is anthropomorphizing AI too much, and the other is not doing it enough. So but nonetheless, we've seen increasing things where the workflow is scientist says, I need these experiments. Database says, I either have the data or I don't have the data, and I'm going to go talk to this robotic lab and automatically generate it, right? Where we have these sort of non-human agents doing some of the science, and I think that will increasingly play a role in our infrastructures. The days of, almost everything is computer controlled now in the big instruments, right? Nobody manually sets the mirrors on the telescope anymore, right? You're sitting at a base station running a bunch of software to do that, and eventually you can see much of that getting automated and having AI control in a fair amount of it. And that's the only way we're going to be able to grow at the rate we do, because we'll always be underfunded.
So first, you bring an academic perspective here in this reality. What are your comments?
I think that the solution is somewhere in between, and it ties very well with the previous question as well. An RI is impossible to train everyone. That's period. Also, I fully and absolutely subscribe to the idea that infrastructure should be open enough so people can push the frontier, figure out new ideas. So the solution that I see for AI or chat-based solution, if we really want to go in that direction, is essentially in between. You don't want a new user, you don't expect rather a new user, a new researcher to, using services of the RI, only have support from a chatbot. You need to have direct training initially from a warm-blooded person. So this cannot scale well, but the trainer activities leading from the RIs to the research organizations, to the academy, can actually help creating this critical mass of initial trainers. From then onwards, if you onboard the new users, then they can actually get support much easier on a much larger scale through chatbots. This will allow a much easier integration of machine learning and AI solutions to the training effort without necessarily sacrificing the quality of the services that are going to be produced, because they are not going to be part of the solutions, but rather assist people in developing the solution in the first place, which is one of the key dangers that I see, which is not anthropomorphizing AI, but rather expecting that AI will solve everything. I really see this in software. It's one of my pet peeves that I create software. How do I do it? I ask ChatGPT to it, and it works. Sure, it works, but it's definitely not the best possible high-quality solution that you should expect from an actual trained person that will write the code. So that's kind of the in-between that I see between using AI to support training versus using AI, period, and like a universal solution for everything.
Thank you. I see that we're out of time, and I know there's a back-to-back panel here. So with that, please join me in giving the panel a big hand. And thank you for attending, and we enjoy the rest of the event.